Good evening. Abigail Adams described the Marquis de Lafayette as dangerously amiable, sensible, polite, affable, insinuating, pleasing, hospitable, indefatigable, and ambitious. Tonight, we dare to add the adjective romantic to that list. A special welcome to tonight's Marquis Monday, featuring author Anne Supsic. Anne Supsic is a docent at the Moravian Museum in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, a dedicated Francophile, and a bookmark collector. When she first learned about a possible romantic relationship between the Marquis de Lafayette and a Moravian Single Sister named Liesl Beckel, she knew she had found the story she was meant to tell. When she's not at home, Anne is traveling the world with her husband, 73 countries and counting, exploring other cultures, and of course, searching for bookmarks. And so it is our honor to welcome Anne Supsic to our broadcast this evening. Anne, welcome.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. And I want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. I'd also like to thank all of you who are joining us this evening. It's a real honor for me and for my book to be part of this celebration of my favorite Frenchman. So for tonight's program, I'm going to start by telling you about the history behind the book. I'll also tell you where I got the idea to write this book in the first place. Then I'll talk a bit about my research, and I'll also explain why I chose a bookmark to play such an important part in the story. After that, we'll have a Q&A where I can answer any questions that you may have for me. So I'm going to begin with someone who really needs no introduction at all, the man of the hour, of course, the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, I have to tell you, a neighbor gave me this wonderful picture of Lafayette, and I have had it up above me here at my writing desk for all the years that I was working on this novel. And most of the time, I really felt like he was looking at me very encouragingly, very motivating. But I have to tell you that towards the end, I swear there were times when he was scowling at me as if he were saying, "For God's sake, woman, get this book done." So I'm sure that he is thrilled to be here with you this evening, and he's got to be very happy to know that he is still remembered and even revered. So let's talk about how it was that Lafayette came to America, and specifically, how in the world did he end up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania? Well, first of all, we know that Lafayette was obsessed with our American Revolution. He's been quoted as saying, "I gave my heart to America. I became obsessed with the rebels and thought of nothing else but raising my banner and adding my colors to theirs." In fact, he snuck out of France, defying his powerful father-in-law and his extremely powerful king. He bought a ship and made his way to America, where he joined George Washington in Philadelphia. Now, it's important to note that Lafayette was only 19 when he came to America. I think too many times we tend to think of him as having been an older individual, probably because we see so many pictures of him with this gray wig on his head. But at least from my standpoint, he was really only a kid. And then on September 11th, 1777, Lafayette was wounded in his very first battle. I can only assume that this guy would have been livid. After all, he traveled all the way from France only to be taken out of commission in his very first skirmish. Now, we do know from history that he tried to downplay his injury, But George Washington had taken quite a liking to the young man, and he was insistent that Lafayette have a full convalescence before he be allowed to return to his post. As a result, Lafayette was taken to a hospital in Philadelphia along with the rest of the wounded. But then, when that city was threatened by the British, he was evacuated and brought north to Bethlehem. Now, you may wonder why Bethlehem? Well, there are two very good reasons. First of all, Bethlehem was known for its medical expertise. In Bethlehem, they always had a doctor who had been trained in Europe, which was a far cry from so many of the colonists where we would have had barbers performing surgery. In fact, Bethlehem was so well known for its medical knowledge that they actually held medical conferences in town. Now, at this time, the Moravians were pacifists, so they did not fight in the Revolution. But when George Washington asked for their help, they turned their brother's house into a hospital. So George Washington would have known that there was a facility ready and waiting for his wounded, along with a really substantial medical expertise to care for them. Now, Lafayette did not stay in the brother's house. I guess because he was a general and a Frenchman, he spent his first night at the Sun Inn, which still exists in Bethlehem. And then the next day, he was taken to the home of the Beckel family to recuperate in a private residence. And the daughter, Liesl Beckel, who had some medical training, was assigned to his care. The Beckel family home is gone, but if you ever happen to visit Bethlehem, you can look for the historic marker on Main Street, which identifies the location of the home and reminds us that Lafayette spent a month there recuperating from his wound. Now, before I go any further, I do just want to introduce my book. It is called The Bookmark, and it is a work of historical fiction. It has two timelines, one in the present and one in the past, but both of them inspired by the fact that Lafayette spent a month in Bethlehem recuperating from his battle wound. He was cared for by a Moravian sister named Liesl Beckel, and gossips of the time speculated of a romance. Then in the modern story, our modern heroine, Abby Prescott, discovers an 18th century bookmark with a secret that may reveal what really happened between the legendary Frenchman and the Moravian maid. So at this point, I'd like to read an excerpt from the bookmark. This is part of the book where Lafayette first arrives in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. "How much further?" Lafayette shouted at the driver. He pounded his fist on the side of the carriage, but still received no response. Perhaps the man was unable to hear him above the clatter of the wheels, or more likely, he simply chose not to answer. "Colonists," Lafayette muttered as he tried without success to find a comfortable position for his wounded leg in the cramped space. He was miserable, and not merely because of the musket ball that had struck him below the knee, although the events at Brandywine Creek still haunted him. That day he had charged into his first battle astride his white horse, suppressing an inappropriate grin as the ground rumbled beneath him and cannonballs created great furrows in the earth. Racing toward his destiny, he had been certain a glorious future awaited him. But fate had a different plan. And now, at Washington's insistence, Lafayette was on his way to Bethlehem for a complete convalescence. He had admired Washington from the first time he beheld the man entering a smoke-filled tavern with a bearing more regal than any European monarch. But this latest order vexed Lafayette. He had not traveled across the ocean to lie about recovering from a superficial injury. His carriage slowed and turned onto the street of a small town. The innkeeper at last night's tavern had described Bethlehem as a grim place run by religious lunatics. But Lafayette sensed only tranquility as he gazed out at immaculate multi-story houses tucked between a curving creek and well-tended cornfields and apple orchards. His carriage finally arrived at the Sun Inn, where a short, balding man introduced himself as Dr. Glatt. "You are a lucky young man," Dr. Glatt said. "The musket ball passed straight through the leg without shattering any bone. You have damaged nerves and muscle tissue, but your field doctor properly cleaned the wound to prevent infection. Many would have simply amputated." Lafayette supposed he should feel grateful, but his thoughts returned to the searing humiliation of being carried on a litter into a room reeking of onions and cabbages, where he was laid out on a table still covered with crumbs from a recent meal, as if he were the main course at one of Louis XVI's banquets, all accompanied by the mocking voices of soldiers joking that they hoped no one would eat him for dinner. "When can I return to battle?" he asked. "In a month, perhaps a bit more." "That is unacceptable," Lafayette roared in his most imperious voice, the one he employed whenever someone tried to thwart his plans. "I must return to the field." Dr. Glatt gave him a steely look. "As I said, a wound like this requires at least a month to heal. Anything short of that, and you risk losing the leg or your life." Lafayette's anger drained away. From the first moment he heard rumors of revolution smoldering in the American colonies, his sole desire had been to join the fight for liberty. He had no intention of forfeiting this opportunity to change the world. He would endure a month of convalescence, but that did not mean he had to like it. "And where will I spend my incarceration?" "You will stay here at the inn tonight, and then I have arranged for you to recuperate in the home of Frederick Beckel, where his daughter Liesl, one of my medical assistants, will attend to you. Rest assured you will receive the best of care. General Washington was quite clear we were to treat you with utmost deference." "A medical assistant?" Lafayette said, raising his voice. "Utmost deference indeed. He would be lucky to survive." Dr. Glatt hesitated before continuing. "While Liesl may not be the most docile of our sisters, she is quite capable. She will change your bandages daily and keep me informed of your progress." Now, we don't know a great deal about Liesl Beckel, but as Kathleen told you, I've been a docent at the Moravian Museum in Bethlehem. It's hard for me to believe this, but it's been for 15 years. So I have learned a lot about the early Moravians, who were a European religious group who came here in 1741 and founded the city of Bethlehem. And it's important to know that they were a very well-educated, cultured, and very enlightened group of people. In fact, in early Bethlehem, women were treated better than they were in much of the world. Girls were educated just like boys, which was unheard of for the time period. And women even held positions of leadership within the church. So I knew right from the beginning that my Liesl was going to be well educated and strong minded, someone who would not be intimidated even by a strong personality like Lafayette's. I did want to mention that historic Bethlehem has recently been named a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I hope you'll forgive me this shameless plug, but this was a 20-year effort, and we couldn't be more honored. And the primary reason we were selected for this is because of the enlightened qualities of the Moravian people. People often ask me, where did you get the idea to write this book? And the answer is, I owe it all to this painting. Now, as you can see in the painting, we have Lafayette, of course, in his full battle dress, and you can see that his wounded leg is discreetly covered with a quilt. In the center, we have Mrs. Beckel, the lady of the house. And on the other side of the table, we have our girl, Liesl Beckel. This was painted by a woman by the name of Eleanor Barba. Eleanor was a student of Walter Emerson Baum, who was an internationally acclaimed watercolorist and also a well-respected art educator. The painting dates to 1934, so you can see how the fascination with Liesl and Lafayette has continued throughout the years. What I'd like to do now is read an excerpt from the book. In the book, our modern heroine, Abby, also discovers this painting at the Moravian Museum. So I'd like to tell you what her reaction was. Abby studied the expressions on the three faces. Lafayette's gaze, rather than looking out at the viewer, turned toward Liesl, while Mrs. Beckel's eyes were downcast, as if she were ashamed or refused to see what was right in front of her. Only Liesl stared directly out of the picture at Abby, a beautiful, confident young woman who looked like she knew exactly what she wanted and wasn't about to let anybody stand in her way. Now, just like my modern character, Abby, I discovered this painting for the first time at the Moravian Museum myself. One day I arrived for work and there was a new exhibit that included this painting. And I have to tell you, I was shocked. I have no idea how I missed it, but I didn't know that Lafayette had spent time in Bethlehem, much less that he had been cared for by a Moravian sister. Now, I am a Francophile through and through. Lafayette has always been my favorite Frenchman. So when I learned of this connection between Lafayette and the Moravians, it was like worlds colliding. And it was at that moment that I realized I had found the story that I was meant to tell. So after I discovered this story, I went straight to the Moravian archives to do some research to find out, for one thing, if this story was really true. The assistant archivist at the archives was wonderful. He pulled out everything he had on Liesl, which granted wasn't a great deal, but he did give me access to the Beckel family genealogy, which confirmed the story and also gave me some interesting insight into the family. And of course, from that point, I did my own research. And I'd like to talk about the three books that I found the most helpful. Now, when it comes to Lafayette, I mean, I could have spent years doing research. There have been so many books written about him, but my favorite that I want to share with you tonight is this one. This is Lafayette in the Somewhat United States by Sarah Vowell. And what I like most about this book is that Sarah Vowell has a very casual, kind of breezy writing style, but she is recognized for her historical expertise. And, this made it really a fun read. This was the book that I relied on to help me get into Lafayette's head, to help me imagine what his thinking process was, how he would react to certain events. So I highly recommend this. It is not a dry history book by any means. This is a real gem. Now, when it came to Liesl Beckel, I had to go more broad. And if you have any interest in the Moravians in the early days in Bethlehem, this is the book I recommend for you. It is Sketches of Early Bethlehem by Raymond E. Myers. Now, the book is out of print, but I was able to get a used copy on Amazon, and it is absolutely wonderful. It's a series of vignettes on life in early Bethlehem. It has a lot of pictures. There we go. Just great information about the early Moravians. But the book that I really could not have done without is this one. This is Moravian Women's Memoirs by Catherine M. Fall. And what Catherine has done is she has translated actual Moravian women's memoirs from the Old German into English. And it's important to understand that the memoir was a very strong tradition in early Bethlehem. Everybody wrote a memoir. It was something that you would work on throughout your life. And when you died, your memoir would be read at your funeral. So in this book, I got to read about Moravians' women's lives written in their own words. This is the book that I depended on to help me understand what it would be like for Liesl Beckel to be a woman in early Bethlehem in 1777. What I'd like to do now is just talk for a minute about historical fiction. Historical fiction is my favorite genre. I love it because I always learn something new. And I also enjoy that feeling of experiencing history, almost like I'm a fly on the wall. Now, writing historical fiction offers the freedom to imagine what might have occurred, to cover incidents that we have no information on. For example, I could imagine the conversations between Liesl and Lafayette. But at the same time, I felt a tremendous responsibility to present the history accurately and to make the fictional parts of the story as plausible as I possibly could. I worked really hard on this for the readers, but also to honor the real people that I've been writing about. Now, you may wonder why I chose a bookmark to play such an important part in the story. And there are actually a couple reasons. If you take a look again at this painting, you'll notice that Lafayette is holding a book in his hands. Well, we know from historical record that during his convalescence, Lafayette read a book called The History of Greenland by a Moravian missionary named Brother Krantz. And it makes perfect sense to me that with his curious mind, he would be fascinated by this because Greenland was a pretty much unknown place. And I'm quite certain that when Eleanor painted this, she had the history of Greenland in mind when she added this book. So it made perfect sense to me that Liesl might offer Lafayette a bookmark so that he could track his progress. And the more I thought about it, I realized that a bookmark would be a perfect vehicle for connecting my two heroines across the centuries. But the other reason is, as Kathleen mentioned, I love bookmarks. I have been collecting bookmarks for over 30 years. I collect them all over the world. And at this point, my collection has just topped 160. And as I like to say, every bookmark tells a story. Now, I did want to mention that I have a website and a blog. I've covered many topics, including Liesl's grave site in the Moravian cemetery they call God's Acre. I also covered the adventure I had when I went in search of Lafayette's grave site in Paris. So if you'd like to take a look at it, the website is easy to remember. It's annesupsic.com. And I also wanted to mention the fact that the bookmark is available on Amazon. It's available as a paperback, as an ebook, and just very recently also as an audiobook. So I want to thank you all for sharing this evening with me and for your interest in my story. And now I get to hear from you during the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Anne. Right now, we have DAR Regent Deborah Thompson, who will be presenting questions during our Q&A session. Debbie.
Good evening. The first question I have, why did you decide to write a dual-themed novel?
Well, when I started to work on this book, I had just finished my first dual-themed novel. It was A Winter Sea by Susanna Kearsley, and I just fell in love with the book and with the format. And the more I worked on writing my book, I had a reservation about whether there would be enough information regarding Liesl and Lafayette to create a full novel. And I also realized that it was very important to me to talk about Bethlehem, both in the past and the present. In many ways, this book is my love letter to Bethlehem. And the dual timeline allowed me to address both back then and now.
Well, it's interesting that Bethlehem was a Moravian outpost, um, but we have one here in Pennsylvania, lower south, in Lidditz, and it was also a hospital
Yes,
for Revolutionary soldiers.
I visited Lidditz and thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yes, it's a lovely little town and quite sweet.
It, it is.
Um, which of the storylines was more difficult to write, the modern or the historical one?
This was kind of surprising because when I started writing this book, I was really concerned about the historical part. I thought this is going to take a lot of effort, a lot of research, and I was really worried about it. But the beauty of historical fiction is that you have a framework. You have historic events that I was able to include in the book. So that gave me timelines and, kind of moved the plot along. Whereas the modern day story, I could do anything I wanted, which might sound great, but it was really daunting to figure out what I wanted to do with that modern story. So I worked very hard to make sure that Liesl and Abby followed similar paths. And if you read the book, you'll notice that some of the chapters are complementary. So that was actually a lot more work than historical research.
Um, can you briefly describe your research and writing process?
Oh, sure. lots of people are curious about this. I know that some writers use outlines. Some writers just start on page one and go to town. I did something that was kind of a hybrid. I love outlines, but I didn't hold myself to that. I would start out with some outlining, but then I would come up with a scene that I thought was going to be really great. So I would write that scene then and there. So I ended up with an outline that had chunks of the book all throughout it. And instead of starting on page one, every day when I sat down to write, I would just write whatever grabbed me that day. Some days I would write about Abby, some days I would write about Liesl. But it wasn't until later in the process that I pulled the whole thing together in a chronological order and made sure that everything, that I needed was there. It was really a fun experience.
Sounds like it was a lot of work, though, trying to
It was,
figure out what the order would be.
oh, it was. And believe me, the sequence of the chapters has changed, I don't know, dozens and dozens of times.
Okay. Um, isn't it strange that Lafayette never returned to Bethlehem during his farewell tour?
Yes, I thought this was quite odd. And that's why in the book, I come up with my own reason for Lafayette not returning. But it is really quite odd because he spent a whole month there and he certainly appreciated the, um, the friendship and the treatment by the Moravian people. So it seemed quite remarkable to me. I mean, he was in Princeton, he was very, very close to Bethlehem. So anyway, I created my own reason, basically, that Liesl asked him not to return. So that's as plausible as anything.
Well, if probably with him being gone then to his own marriage and his own life, she would have married, and to be proper, you don't want to, back then, you wouldn't want to bring any interference back into your life.
Exactly. Actually, though, Liesl never married,
Oh,
which is kind of interesting. And sometimes people feel that that's sad, and there are a lot of stories about Liesl and her
mm,
unrequited love. But it wasn't unusual in Bethlehem for women not to marry. In fact, they had a whole building that was the single sisters' house where single women could live. And this has really intrigued me. And I came to the conclusion that the reason we had so many single sisters is because they could live as single people. In early Bethlehem, a single woman could live in the single woman choir house, and she could have a job, she could work, she could earn money and support herself. So it's just another example of how enlightened these people were.
yeah, it's because, like you said before, women were basically stay home, take care of the kids. You're not educated, you can't write 9 times out of 10. Um, and it's amazing to me when I find these sects that women were important. They needed to be educated, they needed to know, they needed how to be able to pass that information along. Um, so that I always, because you hear about the Indians being heathens, but I was in the Cherokee Indian Reservation and women actually sat on the board
See?
because the chiefs thought that they brought a different perspective to life.
Well,
So
it's
I
kind of,
admire that.
I mean, when you look at the world at that time, women were really forced to marry, many times by their parents, by the dictates of their society, or just the reality that they couldn't afford. They couldn't afford to live alone because they couldn't make money. And in Bethlehem, there were none of those hindrances.
That's very interesting and very enlightening, to be perfectly
That's the
honest.
word.
All right, you told us that we could purchase your book on Amazon,
Yes.
and it's in several forms. So that's really quite nice, and would make it very easy because I stopped buying hardback books or paperback books. I buy it on Kindle.
I do the same thing. And it's wonderful, especially when I travel because I have an entire library with me.
Yes, comes in quite handy, but I live in a very small place and I run out of spots to put books.
That happens too.
Okay, what closing messages would you like to share regarding Lafayette's time in Bethlehem?
Well, I guess I would just like to say that I think Bethlehem was blessed by the fact that he ended up having to spend a month with us. It wasn't his choice, perhaps, but from what I've read, he was also intrigued by these Moravian people. And I like to think that he also left a mark on them, and not just Liesl, but certainly they had never met anyone like him. So having Lafayette in their midst for a month is something that certainly would not have been easily forgotten.
And Germans are good cooks, so he did not suffer meal-wise.
That is very true. I'm sure they fed him very well.
Well, he needed sustenance to get better.
Exactly, exactly. It was all for health.
Well, thank you. That's what I have for this evening, unless anyone else has another question out there.
And we're
Okay.
delighted to have hosted you tonight for the Marquis Monday broadcast. It was a beautiful program, and all of us can't wait to read the bookmark. Your program has been recorded and will be made available for later viewing on our YouTube channel, Lafayette 200 Marquis Mondays. We do hope you have enjoyed our Marquis Monday this evening and invite you to attend our next program, which will take place on Monday, June 16th, with Stephanie Dre, author of The Women of the Chateau Lafayette. Until then, bonsoir. Good night, everyone.